This week we're picking up in Romans chapter 10, verses 14 through 17. We're continuing with our idea of the ABCs of salvation, for we're still in the same part of the letter to the church in Rome that we were last week. So why change the theme? Because Paul's continuing to talk about the things that he started talking about last week. Before we get going on this Bible study, I want to share something with you. I have something on my bucket list, and one of those things I have on my bucket list is that I would love to be a mascot for a professional sports team. Well, today I got a chance to start to get my practice. There I am. I'm the Panther at Glen Allen Elementary School for their reading day. Had a great time at the school running around and playing with the kids, and of course the teachers and the police officers on campus also. It was so much fun being the mascot, and it was my first step into my goal of being a mascot for a professional athletic team sometime in the future. Well, enough about that. Let's move on to our Bible study. Last week we talked about the fact that Paul had quoted Joel. At the end of verse 13 of chapter 10, Paul had quoted Joel saying that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And so we spent some time talking about this concept of calling. And so to call on or calling on means I express faith in, not simply receiving something from. There's a big difference between expressing faith in something and wanting to receive something from. Many of us have faith in things that we want to receive from. We network because we want to make business connections. We want to sell more products. Calling on Jesus is not networking. This is expressing faith. So calling on means that you're saying that you believe. You're saying that you're a follower. That's what the calling on that Paul referred to in verse 13, the quote that he used from the prophet Joel from the Old Testament. That calling on expresses faith in, not simply receiving something from. So last week we had a little quiz, and that was what two parts of the body are involved in salvation. Hopefully you remember these two parts. What are the two parts of the body involved in salvation? I think you got it. Mouth and heart. Yes, we've got to believe in our heart, and then we have to speak it with our mouth. It's a both and. It's not an either or, it's a both and. We can't just believe in Jesus in our heart and never express it with our mouth, never live it out. Likewise, we can't live out a faith in Jesus if we don't have Jesus in our heart. That would just be play acting. We can pretend. Now, granted, we can pretend for a little while, but that's not going to last for very long. So it has to be both the mouth and the heart, and that's the two parts of the body that are involved in salvation. I'm so glad that you remembered that. Well, let's go ahead and open up to Romans chapter 10, verse 14. I'm going to be reading from the New International Version, but you can use whatever version of the Bible that you have. Let's take a look at Romans 10:14. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? This is one of those passages of Scripture that many people have heard outside of the study of Romans. Many a sermon has been preached on these questions, these verses that we're going to be going over. So first and foremost, we have to have an understanding of who are the they. So who is the they that Paul is specifically referring to? I'll give you a hint. He started talking in the beginning of chapter 9 about this group of people, and his heart goes out to this group of people. He wants this group of people to be saved. Yes, Israel. Remember, Paul is a Jewish man. Now, granted, he believes in Jesus and he has a ministry to the Gentiles, but he is a Jewish man. He was raised in the best synagogues. He was raised under the best teaching. He is a very learned and knowledgeable Jewish man, and his heart goes out to his brothers and sisters in the nation of Israel because he wants them to be saved. In fact, at the beginning of chapter 9, he states that he would sacrifice himself, if he could, for the salvation of his brothers and sisters in Israel. But of course, he can't do that. Why can't he do that? Because Jesus already has. The job has already been taken. The deal is already done. So Paul cannot reproduce what Jesus did. Jesus has died once and for all. So we take a look at that verse and we ask ourselves, what is the first question? What is the first question that has here in verse 14? The question is, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? So the first question is, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And that brings us to this understanding that belief initiates salvation. Belief initiates salvation. Now, you might be listening to that, you might be looking at that and saying, duh, but it's important for us to maintain that as a foundation, because we're going to see through the continuing questions that Paul's going to ask in this verse and in the next verse, we're going to see that belief that initiates salvation isn't the foundation you think it is. It's the foundation, but then there is a basement or two or three underneath that. Belief initiates salvation, but there are things that come into play before belief happens. And what we're going to be calling that today as we're studying this passage, we're going to call that the layers of the onion. So let's go ahead and take a look at the layers of the onion. The first layer of the onion that we're going to be unpeeling today is, can anyone believe in Jesus if they have never heard of him? Can anyone believe in Jesus if they've never heard of him? Of course not. It's impossible. Well, I shouldn't say that. I am sure there is someone in all of history somewhere that has made the decision to follow Jesus and they've never heard of him. I don't know who that is. I've never heard a story of it, but the odds are, with all the people in the world, and as long as this has been around, that someone made the decision to believe when they've never heard of him in some way, shape, or form. But basically, when you get down to it, someone cannot believe in Jesus if they've never heard of him. So this is the basement below belief comes to salvation. Before someone can believe, they have to hear of Jesus. Are you with me? All right, let's peel off the next layer of the onion. How will anyone hear about Jesus unless someone tells them? Unless someone tells them. Makes sense. You can't believe unless you hear about it, and there's no way you're going to hear about something unless someone tells you. So here is now the second basement below belief is the beginning of salvation. The understanding that someone must tell you, then in the telling you must hear, and we're going to talk about the difference between listening and hearing in this study today. You need to hear it. So you've got someone telling you and then you hearing. So can anyone believe in Jesus if they have never heard of him? No. How will anyone hear about Jesus unless someone tells them? They can't. Well, why can't they? Because nobody ever seeks something until they know they want it. This is an important layer of the onion when it comes to our relationship with Jesus Christ. You will never look for your keys until you want to drive your car. When you're sitting on the couch, eating ice cream, watching TV, you don't even care. You're not even thinking about your keys. It's not until you say, oh, I need more ice cream, and you want to go to the store that you get up and you say, I want my keys. Now I'm going to go looking for them. Nobody ever seeks something until they know they want it. And a little bit of a side too. You ever notice that whenever anybody finds something and you ask them, hey, did you find your keys? Yes, I found them in the last place I looked. Well, duh, of course, you're not going to find them and then look in another place. I found them in the second to the last place I looked. Nobody ever seeks something until they know they want it. So that this wanting is going to be very important in our conversation today. What does this mean to you and your life? This is one of those trees that fall in the woods, and if no one's around, does it make a sound kind of question. I'm not going to give you the answer. I'm not going to tell you what this means to you in your life. Do you know why? Because I can't tell you what this means to you in your life. I can tell you what it means to me and my life, but I'm not you and you're not me. So we all have to understand that we've got to take these questions that Paul presents here in verse 14. These three questions. Listen to the questions again. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? So again, we see these layers of this onion that belief is important for salvation. Belief is how salvation comes into play. But before there can be belief, there has to be someone that is telling you about it, and you have to hear it. And so what does this mean to you and your life? Again, I can't tell you the answer. Only you can answer that for you. But I can encourage you to ask the question, because it's so important. It's so important for each and every single one of us to take a look at these three questions, understand the condition of those questions, understand the meaning of those questions, and then apply it to our lives and say, well, what does this mean to me and my life? Again, I can't give you the answer. Only you can find that answer. Let's look at verse 15. And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Now notice, we have 3 questions in verse 14, and then we have 1 question in verse 15. But if you look at the 1 question in verse 15, it kind of goes along with the 3 questions in verse 14. So that leads us to ask the question, why did Paul delineate verse 14 and verse 15? Well, the answer is very simple. Paul didn't delineate the difference between those two. Paul did not write chapters and verses. The chapters and verses didn't come until many hundreds of years later, when the early church was putting Bibles together for people to look at. And they needed to make chapters and verses because it makes it easier to study. It makes it easier to reference. It's much better than saying, hey, you know that passage in Romans, I think it's like 3 pages in on the left column, about halfway down. That's going to be very hard if your translation, if your a copy of the Bible is different than the one that someone's looking at. So that's why the early church put in the chapter and the verse breaks. Now that leads us to ask the question, I wonder why they didn't include, and how can anyone preach unless they are sent, that question with the other 3 questions in verse 14. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at that. We're going to go continue to peel back the layers of the onion. So how will anyone share the good news of Jesus unless they are sent to do so? The answer is, they won't. How will anyone share the good news of Jesus unless they're sent to do so? They won't share the good news of Jesus if they're not sent. Sharing your faith isn't the first step on the pathway that leads to faith. Sharing your faith isn't the first step on the pathway that leads to faith. What is the first step? If we know that how will anyone share the good news of Jesus unless they are sent, this is the bottom layer. Remember, we started at the top layer. The top layer was, how then can they call on the one whom they have not believed in? So belief brings to salvation. But you can't believe in someone, and how can they believe in the one of whom they have never heard? That's the first basement. Then we go down the steps to the next basement. And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And, verse 15, how can anyone preach unless they are sent? So we see that sharing your faith isn't the first step on the pathway that leads to faith, the pathway that leads to salvation, not your salvation. Now understand, we're talking about other people's salvation. We're talking about they. And who's the they? Yes, it's Israel. It's Israel. Now, of course, we can expand the understanding of Romans to beyond Israel. It can be about us. It can be about America. It can be about anybody now. But Paul was specifically writing this to the church in Rome about the people in Israel. But we understand that sharing your faith isn't the first step on the pathway that leads to faith. Not your faith, but the faith of someone else. And I guess we can say it's your faith too, because in your journey, you had someone share. You had someone come to you. You had someone who was sent to share the good news to you. So again, I guess I'm wrong. It is about your faith, but easier, I think, for us to put our head around the fact that this is talking about sharing the faith of somebody else. So sharing your faith isn't the first step on the pathway that leads to faith, which leads us to ask, well, what is the first step? Another layer of the onion. The first step is being sent. The first step is being sent. None of us, you, me, no one that you know, no one that we've ever known, can ever come to faith unless someone else accepted the call, were sent to come and share the good news. And so we have to understand that the first step in salvation is the concept of humanity being sent. Humanity being sent. Well, if you take this into account, what does that say about human nature? What does this first step say about human nature? And as you're thinking about that question, I want to present to you a little, give me some poetic license here. I want to present to you a little idea about Matthew's gospel and what's called the Great Commission. Jesus was resurrected. He spent several days on the earth walking around and meeting people. He made himself present to over 500 people. And when he was with the disciples, it was time for him to go, to ascend up into heaven and sit on the right hand of God the Father Almighty. So before he ascended, in Matthew's gospel, we are taught that he gave the Great Commission. Go into all the world and make disciples. Teaching them to obey, baptize them in the name of the Father and Holy Spirit, and I will be with you till the end of the age. And so this is the Great Commission. And then after Jesus shares this, after Jesus sends the disciples, he is taken up into heaven. Now, let's pretend for a moment that Jesus is in that same position. He's with the disciples. He's resurrected from the dead. He's been seen by 500 or more people, and he's ready to ascend into heaven. And so he says, well, guys, it's been nice knowing you. Great ministry for the last 3 years, and I will see you later. And then he goes up into heaven. And as he's going up into heaven, he's saying to himself, I'm assuming that they know they're supposed to share this. I'm assuming that those 12 disciples know that their job now is to share this good news with the whole world. But Jesus doesn't do it like that because he knows human nature. If Jesus would have done that, if Jesus would have ascended up into heaven without the Great Commission, what do you think the disciples would have done? Well, I would hope that 1 or 2 of them at least would go and start telling people about Jesus. But I doubt all 12 would have. It's hard for us to put 12 human beings into any situation and expect they all do the same thing unless they're told. Unless they're told to do it. So what does this first step say about human nature? We must be sent. We have to be sent. We will not share the good news of Jesus unless we accept the calling that we have been sent to share the good news of Jesus. We must be sent because this is what we are called to do. Now, the problem is that many people, when they think about this concept of being sent, when they think about the Great Commission, when they think about preaching and sharing the good news, it terrifies them. This is called evangelism. It terrifies them. And so many people avoid it. Many people say, well, I'm not going to share my faith. The 2 things you don't talk about at the dinner table are religion and politics. I'm not going to do that. Well, the problem is that you've been sent. And how do we know that you've been sent? Because Jesus sent the disciples. The disciples sent others. You figure 12 guys spread the good news. You are studying this Bible study right now online because 12 guys over 2,000 years ago made the decision to accept their calling to go and to share the good news of Jesus. So the disciples sent others, and the others are now you and I. We are part of the others. So in essence, Jesus, when he sent the disciples in the Great Commission, he didn't just stop there. He didn't say to them, you and only you, just you 12, nobody else, go into all the world and preach the good news. He says, go into all the world. And so this was, yes, a specific command that he gave to 12 guys that were standing right in front of him, but also, too, is a command that would be preserved for us so that we would be sent. And so Jesus sent the disciples sent others, and the others are now us. And so we have this responsibility to go and to share. We have this responsibility to build ourselves into the mold of what Paul is talking about in these verses. And again, listen to his words. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? And this is the thing that scares us because we have to acknowledge, you can't read those verses without acknowledging that I have been sent. I have been sent to share the good news of Jesus with the world. However that it looks for me, sharing with my family, my friends, the people at my work, whatever the case may be. We've all been given that commission. And Paul realizes, and God realizes, the fear that it strikes in our hearts to think about this concept of being sent to evangelize. And that's why I believe the early church put this verse separate from the other verses. This is why this is verse 14 and the other questions are verse 13, because look at the end of this verse. Verse 14. It's verse 15, sorry. And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And so when we look at this, we see this is a reference to Isaiah. This is a reference to Isaiah 52:7. And when we look at Isaiah 52:7, we understand that this is something that was written hundreds of years before Jesus ever gave the Great Commission to the disciples, before Jesus was ever born. And this is Isaiah, in essence, giving a little spoonful of sugar, which helps the medicine go down. Because Isaiah was writing to an Israel that was under attack, an Israel that was going to be taken over by foreign powers because they were being punished by God, because they had gotten disobedient. And so the Israel in Isaiah's time was afraid to live into the faith. They made the decision not to want to live into the faith of God. And so this is as it always has been. It strikes fear in us because it's human nature. And human nature in the time of Isaiah is exactly the same as the human nature today, is exactly the same as the human nature back in Adam and Eve's time. Human nature is human nature. So Isaiah 52:7 is shared so Paul can show that this is something that has always been this way. Yes, are you afraid now that you've taken these questions seriously? Yes, of course. But, as it says, the spoonful of sugar, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news. And so he's building us up using Isaiah, because Isaiah was building his people up because they were afraid too. They were dealing with things too. And so this nice little comment at the end, I believe, is the reason why the early church separates these two verses, separates 14 and 15, because even though 15 begins with a question which continues from verse 14, it has the addition of the spoonful of sugar, and it has basically the direction to be sent. But how can anyone preach unless they are sent? And so you have to understand that you're sent to preach. Now, you might not like the word preach, so insert another word. In Greek, you can define preaching, the word for preaching, as testifying, as sharing your faith. You can use many different words. Preaching is just what the NIV uses. So maybe you're not preaching, maybe you're not standing up behind a pulpit on a Sunday morning or standing on the street corner, but you can share your faith. You can testify. Not only can you, you're sent to do that. Jesus has commissioned you to do that. Let's go ahead and look at verse 16. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Now remember, at the beginning of this study today, we realized that the they that Paul is talking about in these verses is Israel. So it goes back to, and here he specifically references the Israelites. Again, not that this doesn't apply to you and me. Israel is an example. Israel's always been an example. That was the intention of God from the very beginning, that he would lift up a specific people to be an example for the world. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? And so this accepted piece is what we're going to be taking a look at in this verse. Everything needed has been given to Israel to bring them to salvation. This is a fact. Israel has the exact same possibility and opportunity that anybody else in the world. Now, understand, we're talking about the year 40 or so in this reference, but you can expand it now and say in 2022, every single person has been given all they need for salvation. They've been given Jesus, that Jesus died on the cross once and for all. So faith in him will bring salvation, regardless of your ethnic background, regardless of your lineage, regardless of your age, regardless of your nationality, regardless of anything. Jesus died once and for all. So everything needed has been given to Israel to bring them to salvation. Everything needed has been given to you to bring you to salvation. In this specific context, in the nature of what Paul has been talking about through chapter 9 up to now, Israel didn't accept. Israel didn't accept the gift. It's not that Israel hasn't been given everything, they rejected it. They did not accept what they've been given. And so when we take a look at this, we understand this basic human concept that a person's willingness to believe or not is always more influential than knowledge or arguments. You cannot argue someone into faith in Jesus. For if you could argue them into a faith in Jesus, someone else could argue them out. This is not about arguments or knowledge. This is about faith. This is about, remember, what two parts of the body? Mouth and heart. This is about the mouth and the heart. So a person's willingness to believe or not is always more influential than knowledge or arguments. If you are listening to this study, if you're studying this Bible passage today and you are a follower of Jesus, then your willingness to believe has made you a follower of Jesus. Not because someone presented you a very logical, drawn-out argument. Now, granted, someone might have given you a logical, drawn-out argument, but any logical, drawn-out argument about any subject, Jesus or anything else, can have a direct opposite logical and drawn-out argument that could counter that. And so we have to understand it comes down to faith. That's why this is called faith. So a person's willingness to believe or not is always more influential than knowledge or arguments. And this is part of this understanding of what Paul has been talking about as far as faith and being sent. It's all about your willingness. Are you willing to accept that call? Are you willing to accept that faith? And that's very important for us. He again references Isaiah 53:1. Israel's refusal to believe goes all the way back to the days of the prophets. And here he makes this reference from Isaiah 53:1. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? And so again, Isaiah 53:1, this is the beginning of what's called the suffering servant song. If you go back and you read Isaiah 53 right now with Jesus goggles on, you will be amazed at how nobody figured Jesus out, because Isaiah 53 talks all about Jesus, just very clearly. Now, we have to understand that Isaiah was writing that some 500 years before the birth of Jesus, so 500 years before Jesus was born in the manger in Bethlehem. No, they couldn't have put that together with Jesus because they didn't know anything about Jesus. But Isaiah was prophesying about Jesus. But in that prophecy, he also shares Israel's refusal to believe. Their refusal to believe in that moment when God was needing to teach them a lesson. And it goes on with Israel's refusal to believe, as Paul is demonstrating, to when Jesus comes. That Israel's refusal to believe goes all the way back to the days of the prophets. And you can even go even further back than that, and you can make the argument that our refusal to believe, Israel's refusal to believe, goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. Humanity's refusal to believe goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. But that's a whole other conversation for another day. Those who disbelieve do so because they don't want to believe. They don't want to believe. This is why we always talk about the fact that God is in the business of transforming your want to. For if you want to do something, you'll find the time. If you want to do something, you'll find the money. If you want to do something, you'll find a way. And those who disbelieve do so because they don't want to believe. They don't disbelieve because of the fact that there's all this amount of evidence that says you can't do this, you can't believe. They disbelieve because they don't want to believe. And it's so important to understand that want to. That want to is essential as we study this word and as we go into the end of this passage. So Romans 10:17, thinking about people who disbelieve, don't disbelieve because they don't want to believe. Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. So consequently, because we understand that people don't believe because they don't want to believe, faith comes through the hearing of the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. And who shares the message? We do. Who shares the message that we hear through the word of Christ? We do. That's our responsibility. So we look at these verses and we know we have learned something. We've learned a process. The first thing we've learned is that Jesus sends out his disciples to preach. You can change that word preach to testify, to witness, to share, whatever the case may be. But Jesus sends out his disciples to preach. He sent out his disciples in the Great Commission in Matthew, and it's not just the 12, it's for all of us. So if you are a follower of Jesus, then you have accepted the commission to go out and to share the good news. Those who hear what you have to say, those who hear what is preached or testified to, have the opportunity to believe. Again, we can't make anybody believe. All we can do is present them an opportunity. So those who hear have the opportunity to believe. Everybody has that opportunity to believe. Every single person has the same opportunity as anyone else because Jesus died once and for all. So those who believe call on Jesus. They call on Jesus for their faith. They call on Jesus in their life. So those who believe call on Jesus. And as we learned at the beginning of this passage that we talked about from last week, all who call on Jesus will be saved. All who call on Jesus will be saved. Not some that call on Jesus will be saved. Not just the pretty ones who call on Jesus will be saved. Not just the rich ones or the poor ones or the white ones or the black ones. It doesn't matter. All who call on Jesus will be saved. Well, in order for someone to call on Jesus to be saved, we must understand that we have been sent to preach. And that's the thing that strikes fear into our hearts. And when you think about it, it probably strikes fear in your heart. How will I share my faith? How do I share my faith without offending? How do I share my faith without causing problems? And those are all good questions, but they're questions that you must wrestle with, and there's questions that you must tackle. For this is the ABCs of salvation. because you have been sent. You have been sent to share the good news of Jesus. And that good news of Jesus that you send will be the beginning of someone else coming to faith. You might just plant a seed. They might not come to faith in your presence. You might never know about it, but you will plant a seed for someday they will come to faith. And so that's where we're going to leave off today in Romans chapter 10, verses 14 through 17. Next week, we're going to pick up in verse 18. So please join us. And if you know somebody that could benefit from this Bible study, please share it. Share it with somebody else, because Bible study is no good if we just do it alone. So until next week, stay safe and stay sane.